Good morning, Olympia. This is the Pitboss Review, number 11, here with Pat Pitboss, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, trying to push back against the wave, the onslaught of insanity facing Western culture, trying to put the finger in the dike, so to speak. And thanks for tuning in once again. Love it or hate it, here I am going off on another tangent in the name of trying to save what's left of a rational discourse regarding the crashing to the ground versus building something of our Western society, or trying to retain something of our Western society in a physical, an emotional, a psychological, and a spiritual state. If you want to listen to the indigenous teachings regarding that stuff, you take a look at the indigenous medicine wheel, and they look at basically all of our reality, all of our personal, the human reality, our societal reality, our national reality, our global or universal reality as being reflected in a physical sense, an emotional sense, a psychological sense, and a spiritual sense. So if we can apply those principles, and you look at the person as being a holistic person, we can look at our fitness, and we can look at our health, and we could look at our strength as being our physical strength, health and fitness, our emotional strength, health and fitness, our psychological strength, health and fitness, and our spiritual strength, health and fitness. Now, I'm not talking about hierarchy, I'm talking about ecology. So if you look at the indigenous spirituality with this stuff, what are we doing to maintain as a society, as individuals, our strength, our health, our fitness, our balance when it comes to our emotional self, our physical self, our psychological self, and our spiritual self? And so there's a movement in our society, especially Western materialist society, away from transcendent spirituality, away from those concepts even of tradition that had a sacred aspect to them, where we had some level of transcendence over materialism towards, iconography, idolatry, the idea that materialism is the highest point that we can ever achieve. You take a look at what is popular in modern culture, the crass materialism, what car you drive, what kind of money you make, what kind of clothes you wear, what your brand names are. All of this stuff becomes important, while who you are on a core fundamental level gets disregarded. It's thrown on the wayside, the baby out with the bathwater, because that's not important in a materialist society, like a gross capitalist society that commodifies everything. It makes, if it's not making money for you, then it's not worth it. You can destroy nature, you can destroy people, you can destroy lives because it's not profitable. You take a look at a country's worth and they say, what are the natural resources? Well, they look at it as resource. They don't look at your land as being integral. What is the importance of the land and our connection with the land? They think of it, what can we exploit and sell for profit? And this is one of the hugest problems that we have when as a colonial society, have disregarded indigenous teachings or pre-colonial knowledge. And it doesn't matter where in the world. We're talking like, sure, yes, here we are in central Canada. It's quite clear we're talking about land back and reconciliation and decolonization. But what are we going to replace that with? We need to decolonize our hearts, if you really want to think about it. And one of the first ways of decolonizing our hearts and looking at this stuff is listening to indigenous voices, reading the books on indigenous knowledge, and then you start to realize, well, guess what? The indigenous knowledge of Canada is very close to the indigenous knowledge of Europe, and is very close to the indigenous knowledge of, the Polynesians, of the Maori tribes of New Zealand, of the Aboriginals of Australia. There is a pre-colonial current that is very, very close all around the world. And why was that erased with a certain methodology of monotheism that came in that generally said this tribe is the ruling chosen ones and we've got a right to exploit everything else and exploit every culture that came before it, and that progressively prioritized profit over people, that replaced gold for spirit. They replaced spirit with gold. You take a look at like certain very well established, churches, in their own city states that have mountains of gold and hidden libraries that nobody can access. They've stolen the technology, the spiritual and psychological and emotional technology of all the pre-colonial people. They suppressed it with violence and fire and colonialism. And then they tell you, but we've got the truth. All you have to do is tithe to us and obey. You need to tithe and obey. But there are principles. There are principles. If you go past, what the churches have become, the exploitive principles that the churches have become, you have to realize that in these traditional senses, these old school, I guess, clergy and theologians that were emotionally invested in the truth behind, I guess, monotheistic like Catholicism or, Judaism or even Islam. These old school theologians recognized that behind all the dogma, there is the esoteric current of right and wrong, of hierarchy, of good and bad, good versus evil. The Zoroastrians were probably the first religion to really conceptualize the idea of the principle of a universal positive versus the principle of a universal evil or a universal negative. And these two principles got carried over to the other monotheism that came after it, be it probably Judaism would be the next monotheistic belief system that really had, righteousness versus depravity, and the idea that it got carried over, I guess that would be God and Satan, right? The core principles of like universal right and universal good and universal high transcendent ideas and universal wrong and universal bad and degenerate ideas, right? So my notes here for today's podcast largely have to do with a very interesting occurrence in contemporary politics. And, if you know me, you know that I used to be very much a fringe dweller. I've been tattooing for 30 years. I've been in, body modification, hook suspensions, rituals. The whole rite of passage trip has been very integral to my life. I was an underground dweller, for a chud, cannibalistic humanoid underground dweller for most of my life. And I got to know fringe philosophy quite well. And I went to a lot of crazy places, whether it's street life, drug life, BDSM community, religious extremism. And I got to know, whether through the black metal scene or the oi scene or, all these different communities that I've been involved with, the rights and the wrongs and the ups and the downs. And I got to know the rationale that these people use to justify their positions. Okay, so I guess that's one thing, the rationale. So as a furious young man, I got recruited into a white nationalist skinhead gang. As I grew up, I got kind of fell into the apocalyptic, process Church of Final Judgment through the hardcore like Holy Terror movement, and I really got into alternative philosophy, dark kind of stuff, like the whole satanic trip for a while, obsession with serial killers, obsession with like power and sexuality. I got really into the BDSM community for quite a while. I'm still floating around there. I know these industries, I ran a stripper agency. I've been tattooing 30 years. Like I know a lot about these alternative philosophies. So now that I'm older and I'm wiser and, I've emerged from the other side of really dark places. It's funny because I'm floating around political. I guess that's the other element. While I was in these, I realized that progressive leftist woke policies really supported me to do whatever the fuck I wanted to do, man. It's my human right. I've got a right to tie people up and fuck their ass or whatever the case may be, because that's my human right. I'm not hurting anybody, man. They want it done. Like, who are you to judge? So I saw this guy, and he's ranting about, I guess, what was it? People protesting children watching these sexualized fetish shows, and why people are saying, well, kids need to be exposed to this. And this guy's protesting it, and this guy runs up and he's like, hey man, you're this conservative and you really got to do the math, because over there you've got Nazis and they're protesting drag queen story hour and you're protesting drag queen story hour. So if Nazis are agreeing with your policies, maybe that's something you need to examine, man. Yeah, probably, because those like hateful, imbalanced whack jobs on the far right that just hate people. Yep, they hate the same people that conservative politicians or conservative people disagree with. So they hate what conservatives disagree with. And conservatives want to have a rational discussion on why what you're doing is potentially problematic, while those crazy lunatics over there, they just want to destroy it. They just want to shut it down because they hate it, right? They're extremists, right? But at the same time, what we're not talking about is, hey, liberal person, if communists and Satanists, literal Satanists, are agreeing with your policies, maybe that's something that you need to examine. Maybe that's something that needs to be put on the forefront of, like, am I on the right side of history if literal Satanists are agreeing with what I'm putting out there? Now, that isn't being talked about. Now, because there's been a movement in the progressive materialist imbalance towards materialism communities and science communities and philosophy communities. No longer do the philosophers and the thinkers of our time really contemplate the potential for transcendental spirituality. God is dead in modern academia. They've killed off God and replaced it with materialism. And if material sciences can't prove something, it obviously doesn't exist. And no longer do we listen to the Eastern philosophers or the Western philosophers, the Greek and Roman philosophers, or the Buddhas or the Krishnas or the Lao Tzus about the philosophies that are guiding our actions. It's all science. It's all materialism. So it's very, very strange that when I was involved with various incarnations of the underworld, some friends and I really started getting into the organizing. We got into organizing and trying to found what we thought was a social justice spiritual movement called the Satanic Temple. Okay, so the Satanic Temple, their principle largely is that they are against arbitrary authority. They're against, they're against superstition. They say they're against superstition. If you can't prove it, then we don't believe in it. We adhere to the best scientific knowledge, and if the best scientific knowledge can't prove it, we don't apply it to our belief system. Yeah, okay. Unless you're trans, then you can invent whatever identity you want without any scientific proof, but that doesn't really factor into their stuff. So these Satanists, they like to say that they're supporting like these tolerance and these like ideas of acceptance, equity, every woke principle you have, and they justify it that they consider ruling governments kind of the idea of God, and Satan is the liberation from these ruling tyrannical authority figures.
A gift from Lucifer, the light bringer, the morning star, and the rebel. We are Satanists. We engender moral, spiritual, and sexual freedom, personal independence, and insist upon personal choice in all things. We care for the significance of the individual spirit and personal moral responsibility. If you stand here today and embrace your nature, are free-thinking, self-governed, and godless, you too are a Satanist in the eyes of many in your own community, including those who represent you in your governments.
So that's a very interesting thing, and I think it's something we need to consider, that when your woke policies are also mirrored by the local Satanists, maybe you need to examine that as well, because it's a failing society, in my opinion, that regards tolerance as a virtue in itself, regardless of what is being tolerated. One of the things that I think is very interesting about these people, these contemporary Satanists, and it's very important to differentiate between the Church of Satan, which was more of a militant, individualist, egoist organization versus the collective. But the Satanists, the modern day Satanic Temple Satanists that advocate for the liberation and tolerance, the liberation from artificial authority, they want to have human rights, and whatever they want to do should be their right. And when you talk about this, it's like, well, where's the end game? Where's the end game in elimination of transcendental hierarchies of right and wrong? And you're liberated to do what? You're liberated to act however you want. And one of the ones that they're really into the advocating of like defunding the police and community policing, and we have a right to do whatever we want, and you cops need to shut it down, you governments need to shut down. Like they're almost like anarcho, communist types. But what they don't realize is when we establish or when we get rid of the rule of law, none of these people are prepared to prosper in an environment where might makes right.
I'm a father of 4. I can't even let my kids go to the corner store, any of the corner stores around here. So in California, we decided to decriminalize drug use and possession of certain amounts. And then we decriminalize lower crime like theft under $1,000. Well, what that turns into is you can't let your kids go to the corner store because they're out there getting high. And then they get really, really high. They go inside and they ransack the place violently. My family was over here at the drugstore less than half a mile away getting 50's ice cream. That's exactly what happened. Guys run in, beat up the clerks, who's like, why would you do that? Steal a bunch of stuff and leave, and nobody does anything. There's a really nice park right there. I can't let my kids go there. Overrun by homeless encampments. They're just out there getting drunk, getting high all day. I'm telling you because a lot of you just see this stuff on TV. But we're out here in Los Angeles living it, man.
Like there's a book by Ragnar Redbeard, and he sums up, which is largely an extremist viewpoint, that the stronger you are, the more you can get away with whatever you want in this society. And that has been the way of the world since the beginning. They consider this one of like the most evil tomes ever written, these TST people, and authority and violence is just the worst thing ever. But in their idea that we need to community police, oh my God, if some violent schizophrenic with a long track record of violence and attempted murder and assault, suddenly he gets choked out and accidentally loses his life, that's a racist murder. So these people are kind of, they're off kilter, and they don't realize that, like, without rule of law, you better be able to prosper in an area where the strong rule the weak. And as a matter of fact, there was one of the members of the Satanic Church. He was a priest of the Satanic Church. His name's Boyd Rice. He had a maxim that said, well, in a world where might makes right, the strong will rule the weak, and the smart or the clever will rule the strong. And that's a fact. That's a simple fact of, like, I guess the biological world, that those with power will dominate those without power, and those with intelligence and, the ability to manipulate will dominate those without, or with power. They will dominate the strong. And that's an unfortunate reality. So what we do as a civilized society, like the progressive left, they'd like to think that we should appeal to our greater nature, to our civilized nature, to our higher nature, but they can't really tell us where that higher nature comes from because they've disregarded transcendental spiritual wisdom of thousands of years. So they say, well, our greatest human nature, this is what we appeal to. This is what we are appealing to, is our humanist nature. But they won't give you the yardstick by which they measure this. They just say that it's our highest nature. So when they're getting choked out by a lunatic, or they got a gun to their head by the local warlord who's ruling their autonomous zone, why aren't they saying, well, man, your greater human nature, your civilized nature should be ruling. You shouldn't be choking me out or raping me or holding this gun to my head. They drop the ball when they say this, like, oh, get rid of all arbitrary authority. Okay, so the arbitrary authority is gone. So now real authority rules in, and real authority is based on the ability to impose your will on another. Well, that's immoral. What you think that suddenly everybody in the world is going to become moral when you get rid of arbitrary authority? So in a world where might makes right, you would think that the moral people would designate other moral people to defend that civilization with the right to use a controlled level of violence when needed in order to curb chaos or curb violent people with strength from imposing their will on those without strength or peaceful people. And those moral people that they designate to defend civilization against chaos and violence would be almost like a policing agency. And that policing agency would be controlled and regulated, and hopefully they wouldn't hire whack job racists or violent exploiters or corrupt people to be part of these echelon, this like moral kind of coded people that can use controlled violence. But that's who we designate, because hypothetically we get rid of government. We get rid of the police. So everything's chaos for a while, and those with guns can exploit those without, and those with muscles can exploit those without, and those with teeth can bite those without. Sooner or later, we're going to beg for those with muscles and teeth and guns to protect us from the mean people with muscles and teeth and guns. And who are those going to be? Are we going to give them uniforms? Are we going to give them tools in order to defend ourselves? Are they going to be the weakest among us and the most inept and like the most intellectually elite? No, they're going to be the working class blue collar guys that can lift things up and use tools. So all the people that the progressive left and the Satanists are deriding right now eventually will be the people that they depend on when they get their utopian state. Because they're forgetting that the utopian state they keep advocating for also depends on a mass shift in human psychology where everybody is peaceful. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. As a matter of fact, I don't see human selfishness eradicating in the near future. So how is it that you think that your utopian society where everybody's consent is paramount is suddenly going to exist when you defund the police? Who's going to show up when the aggressive, drug addicted, alcoholic, drunk lunatic is beating his children or his wife with a baseball bat? Are you going there? Are you going to show up? Who's going to walk in where there's the screaming lady from your decriminalized drug society where tolerance is a virtue, liberation is a virtue, freedom is a virtue, where the crazy drug-induced lady is screaming at the voices in her head and waving her knife around the street? Are you going to take it off of her? Or are you going to try and call some bigger, scarier, better prepared person to put his or her life on the line to save those that can't do it themselves? 100% you're going to call for the fucking police. So Friedrich Nietzsche, and this is to paraphrase, he put forward the idea that those that cannot rule themselves will always be ruled by others. So this is a very important principle to consider. Like, if I can't control myself, goddamn rights I'm going to be controlled by somebody else. And if I can't adhere to the basic rules of a civilized society, well, guess what? I won't be permitted to exist in a civilized society. And it doesn't matter if this is a city, a community, a school, a tribe, a workplace. Like, those principles remain the same. If I can't adhere to the basic rules, if I can't control myself, if I don't have self-discipline, then somebody else is going to help me adhere to the rules and have self-control and discipline me. And you know what? Right now in the news, I just saw it. I guess he's the premier of Ontario. He got in trouble because, oh my God, he advocated that parents used to spank their children, and the children were set straight by that. We all grew up, at least my generation. You're going to get it when your dad gets home if you don't get in line, because that kept our civilization working for 6,000 years, 10,000 years, 20,000 years. But in the last, 40 years of our technological wondrous society where everybody can share their opinions very, very quickly with a lot of authority in an instant, we've dismantled the structure, the tradition that came with this for I don't know, millennia, right? So if you take a look at the continuum between left and right wing politics, you and actually it's funny, I had this conversation with ChatGPT, and it told me straight up, like, if the left values liberty and freedom and tolerance to a toxic level, that's when chaos ensues in society. That's when eventually it's going to make a system where might makes right? Because liberty, freedom, and tolerance without restraint is degeneration. Straight up, it's absolute deterioration of order. Now, the right, when they get to the extreme, valuing duty, responsibility, and order to toxic level, gives birth to tyranny and totalitarianism, which is another toxic deal. So if you want to think about it, like the ultra woke people, these people are advocating chaos. They're advocating tolerance to the point of chaos. And the ultra right, the right wing lunatics, they're advocating like order and duty to the point of authoritarian like tyranny. So a traditional mindset, or a traditionalist mindset, would probably be right in the middle, and it would value balance and discernment within the confines of natural law or dharma or right living. It would look at the examples that, like, I guess the biological nature has given us, which is as close to a divine kind of manual that we have, because it's written in the laws of physics, the laws of biology. And we would take a look at that and we would say, oh, okay, if this is how nature works, maybe we should emulate it. Which is personally, I guess, why I generally, as far as a pre-colonial belief system, tend to adhere to, I guess, more of the Hindu model, because it's the closest to a pre-colonial polytheistic model that we have. And even in Hinduism, there's a ton of information on how you should behave in accordance with Dharma. And that carries over to Buddhism, which was an offshoot of the Hindu system that existed before it. But even Christianity has a large amount of the Buddhist philosophy in it. They're a little bit of an upstart against the systems that existed before it. But Buddhism and Christianity do have a system of self-improvement that, if you follow, gives us a civilized nation. It gives us a civilized behavior. It gives us a civilized self, right? Because we've forgotten those pre-colonial systems of the indigenous wisdom of, Europe, of North America, of South America, of Australia, Africa, all these other places. We've forgotten those indigenous wisdoms. So what is the closest link we have? And it's probably, Hinduism to shamanism to animism. So I got in a debate. It wasn't that long ago with a person who is like a representative of the Satanic temple in Toronto. And this is one of the nails in the coffin of wokeism for me. It got to the point where it's just like, you people are so blinded by your dogma, you don't want to have a good faith conversation anymore. You seem to know it all, and you haven't considered the reality of the situation, because if it goes against your dogma, it's obviously evil and needs to be shut down. It is absolute extremism. And this guy had 3 points that we argued about, or that we debated about, on a couple different occasions. And I want to kind of touch on each in order. The first one was, this guy was quite against what he called the aesthetic of fascism, and how we should no longer wear things like combat boots or army jackets or camouflage or, fatigues, or carry, tactical gear, because those are all symbols of militancy and fascism. And if we stand against fascism, we should not be wearing them. I guess he would prefer us all wearing beads and Roman sandals, right? And then the second element that we debated, he was absolutely convinced that the principle of capital punishment is based on revenge, and there is no reason that anybody should ever be executed. And I'm like, okay, so I'd like to touch on that. And I debated with him, and I've got my reasons, but he was convinced it's only punishment and there's no justification. And I'm like, okay, cool. Now that your friends are starting to dogpile me, it's no longer a good faith conversation, and I'm not discussing directly with you. So I guess I will just step out of this one, even though you are wrong. You are absolutely wrong, and you don't realize, because you've never been on the street and dealt with actual evil before. And then there was the element of TST stands against oppressive legislation of human rights, and the principle of human rights. And I asked him, I'm like, well, where do we limit those rights? Well, man, it's whatever you want to do, man. Whatever you want to do, as long as you're not hurting anybody. And what's really hurting somebody if they consent to it? And where are the limits of consent, man? As long as people are consenting, you can't tell them how to live. Well, And so my counterpoint was, well, where do we draw the line on what people can consent to? Can they consent to self-harm? Can they consent to death? Can they consent to mutilation, self-mutilation, and abuse? Then how far does that degree go? And this is coming from a guy who's involved in BDSM. And I deal with elements of deep consent all the time. People that consent to be bruised, they consent to be cut, they consent to be pierced and hung from roofs. So you tell me, what's the limit of consent? So I want to touch on these as much as time allows on each of these points, right? And I want to try to be a rational voice against this extremism. Because if we aren't a rational central voice against extremism, the other extremism will rear its ugly head. I've been saying for a while, if you don't want jackboots on the street, marching, burning books, we need to start saying enough is enough as a rational, normal society, as a common sense thinker, while society is going insane with an extremist left-wing agenda. If you don't want jackboots and ultra-right totalitarian tyrants emerging, rational society needs to settle down and say, fuck, dude, enough is enough. Okay, so the aesthetic of fascism and how that's oppressive. This person tended, like, they put forward, again, just to touch on it again, that if any progressive, woke, social justice advocate, TST or otherwise, is wearing things like, army jackets or army pants or camouflage or combat boots or anything like tactical, militant kind of vibe, that they're subtly advocating for fascism. And I understand where he's coming from. I get the principle of it because I was a strict vegan for about 4 years. I've been a vegetarian for about 19 years. And I recognize that wearing leather also encourages people to support an industry that slaughters animals and commodifies life. It supports a capitalist endeavor where it's okay to oppress and slaughter and profit off of the suffering of others. I get that. So I understand where he's coming from. But it also makes me think, as a guy that wears camo, that is an outdoor kind of mind, survival, hunting, farming. I don't hunt yet, but these are things that come into play where, the best outdoor gear is largely made by the military. It's very important to consider that almost every natural animal in the world has some inbuilt element of camouflage to defend itself, right? Almost every animal in the natural world, in the biological kingdom, will also defend itself and fight if cornered or attacked. So the movement of people to take away the masculine, the divine masculine principle of being able to fight and bite and claw your way out of trouble and continually turn the other cheek is almost a disarming move. And it makes me wonder, who are the players behind this principle of continual disarmament, right? Of citizen disarmament and no more the citizens shouldn't have any tactical equipment. They shouldn't they shouldn't glorify militarization because that encourages the police state and encourages a justification of militancy in the police and the military and da-da-da-da-da. But I don't care. Well, no, actually, nature doesn't care if you're a field mouse or a rabbit or any other a little bird. The fact of the matter is, even these animals' play from a very early age is to evade, escape, adapt, and overcome. To fight, to claw at the belly, to push something off of them. Or if these things are predators, which again is a very normal and healthy part of an ecosystem, which has been eliminated by our modern morality. We don't talk about the positive aspects of predatory nature. But if you're a predator, you watch your dogs and cats play when they're young. They're playing to fight. And playing to fight is playing to kill. These animals, from a very, very early age, they learn to stalk, to chase, to take down, and to slay prey. Now, we can apply these systems, these natural biological systems, to a society. That there are those traumatized individuals from traumatized environments that end up being predatory. And from a very early age, they are training as play to stalk and chase and to take down and to slay their prey. Now, as a civilized people, increasingly we are told that we are not supposed to be able to defend ourselves. We are not. We're not even supposed to evade, escape, adapt, and overcome. We're not allowed to set traps in our homes. We're not allowed to defend our property. We have to. We're hobbled almost as domesticated and declawed animals to call the authorities to do the dangerous work for us. I disagree with that. I really disagree with that. I'm a martial artist. I've been training to be self-sufficient again for a very long time. I'd like to live off grid. I'd like to not depend on these systems of exploitation or not participate in them. But that being said, that's also being prepared for a world where might makes right is the motto, where you might have a bad guy come to your land, and how are you going to defend it? Are you prepared to defend it against the bad guy, or are you going to be the grass to the sheep? Are you going to be eaten and be helpless? So almost every animal in the natural world will bite you if it's cornered. It will fight off the predator. And our weird attitude of civilization says that civilized people no longer defend themselves. They're no longer prepared to defend themselves. They should no longer have the tools of self-defense or the knowledge of self-defense or the ability to defend themselves. And this is ridiculous. And this carries over to the idea that a noble, justice-oriented, ethical person shouldn't have a militarized aspect of themselves. When I disagree with that 110%, I think a strong border, a tall fence makes for good neighbors. I've got my boundaries, and if you cross my boundary, you should know why you shouldn't cross my boundary. My one security consultant friend had a very interesting point in one of his seminars that as a security personnel, you are the line of protection because those people that are behind you cannot protect themselves. So you need to be prepared to meet any challenge from any person that's going to come to damage those behind you. And you should be trained and tooled to the point where you have an ethical application of violence in order to stop those that would use an unethical application of violence for their selfish needs. As a matter of fact, your ethical application of violence is not even a selfish need. You don't want to do it. You're doing it for the safety of others. And these are not equivalent principles of violence. One is a justified violence and one is unjustified violence. And so the idea of not starting, do no harm, but take no shit is a very, very ethical way of looking at this. He's a small predator, but we can examine the honey badger. The honey badger, if you look it up, there's a great video on YouTube where it's called like Honey Badger Takes No Shit. It's hilarious because this little guy basically lets snakes and lions and jackals and hyenas know, I'm just doing my thing, man. You fuck with me, you're going to get it. And you're going to know why you shouldn't fuck with me. And so the idea of your boundaries being strong and a nation having a strong army and saying you should not come to take what we have, to injure our people, or to violate us. The idea, or even as an individual, I'm going to respect you. You have your right to do whatever you want, but you don't have the right to encroach on me physically, emotionally, psychologically, or spiritually without me defending myself. Or my family. You don't have the right to encroach on them without me defending them because they can't defend themselves. And if you don't understand that, I don't know what's wrong with you. I don't know. Potentially, I used to walk everywhere, and our city is getting more and more violent. And so I carried a knife for a while, and then I did inventory. I did personal inventory. I'm like, I'm not willing to stab somebody in an altercation. So I might carry an impact tool if I need a tool. I might wear steel-toed boots. Or, God forbid, I train in martial arts and I can take somebody down with just my hands, right? I understand the use of force continuum versus right and wrong, like how much force I am allowed to defend myself. But guess what? The bad guys don't care about a use of force continuum. They'll come up to you with a machete because they want your cell phone. So, I'm of the opinion that if you try to rob me, I'm going to win, and I want you to go home with less. I want you to know that you shouldn't have tried to rob me. I'm going to take your shoes. I'm going to take your pants. I'm going to take your wallet, and you walk home empty-handed. How does it feel? Maybe you shouldn't have fucked with me in the first place. See, my girlfriend disagrees with this. She thinks live and let live is like that. But I think if you're a predator, maybe you should learn why you shouldn't be a predator against certain people. The honey badger goes after the testicles of lions that try to attack it. They know why they shouldn't attack a honey badger. So be the badger. I'm very much of the opinion that we should Aspire to be the badger. Live and let live. Don't fuck with me. So the taking the shoes thing, it kind of reminds me of something that happened in Saskatoon and was a habit in Saskatoon until it got outed, and it was the Starlight Tours. And this was a habit in Saskatoon police. You could look up the term Starlight Tours on Wikipedia. You're going to get, even if you look up Saskatoon City Police, you're going to get the Starlight Tours. And this was a habit back in the day when the police would run into, let's say, a belligerent person and they're drunk out of their head. And this happened largely like, what's the term? Disproportionately to indigenous people in Saskatoon. They'd run into a belligerent person who's drunk, and instead of going through the paperwork of running them through or keeping them overnight in the drunk tank, they would just drive them out of town and say, walk it off, buddy. Which is fine, when it's plus 25 at night or plus 20 at night and these guys get dropped off out of town, they're going to be pretty much sober by the time they get back to town. That's okay. But again, there were corrupt elements of the police that took this to a ridiculous level of tyranny, of violence and exploitation that started dropping Indigenous men, specifically largely, out of town in the winter. And, they would freeze. Like, there was numerous deaths. I think there was like 3, maybe 4 deaths that happened when the cops were dropping these guys out of town without, some of them, they lost their shoes. Some of them, or maybe the guy was running around drunk being a crazy lunatic without his shoes on when the police picked him up, but they drop him off out of town in minus 15, minus 10, minus 20 weather, and these guys can't make it back to town. They freeze to death, and that's an atrocity. So that's basically the police deciding they have the right to take somebody's life. You can't tell me that those cops that dropped these guys out of town just for being drunk and belligerent to save themselves the time of doing the paperwork and putting them through the drunk tank. You can't tell me that they had the right to murder somebody, and I don't buy that. But at the same time, during the summer, maybe everybody's getting a favor done for themselves by just being dropped off out of town and having to walk off their booze instead of ending up in jail, maybe going to court, having their freedom taken away from you. You have an hour and a half of walking it off. You don't have your entire weekend in the drunk tank. I think that's really what it boils down to. But those guys were just drunk. They were drunk and out of line. And, the police decided that they could make this executive decision, which turned out tragically a few times. So there's both sides to that story, the summer and the winter side, the paperwork and loss of liberty and potential, incarceration versus 3 hours of inconvenience. So there's a few different sides to that Starlight Tours story. But it also carries over to the second thing that I argued with this satanic guy from Toronto, that he's of the opinion that capital punishment is revenge no matter what. That the only reason that any society would advocate for execution of a prisoner is because they want revenge for what this person has done. And again, him being a Satanist, of course, because they want tolerance, they want liberty, they want freedom, they want everybody to have equality or equity, and they claim to be very trauma informed, and yeah, for sure, because you've killed off the principle of right and wrong. You've killed off the principle of transcendent values versus degenerate values, and those people that do hard work to climb up progressively refined behavior towards transcending yesterday are doing hard work, and those people that choose to throw off the hard work and just dive into pleasure seeking and degeneracy eventually end up in some pretty monstrous states. Right? And don't get me wrong, I recognize that progressive levels of trauma push people down. They do. They drop you in levels. You might be a compassionate individual, and then trauma knocks you down to a survival level or to a power-seeking, kind of personality. And then progressive trauma pushes you down more into a survival methodology or a pleasure-seeking methodology. And progressive trauma pushes you down into a predatory mentality. And progressive trauma pushes you down from a predator to an absolute monster. And I get that. This is actually being trauma informed, in case you fucking dicks out there don't realize how trauma actually works. This is what happens. Progressive traumas stop you from ascending personal improvement and push you down to more degenerate behavior. And this person doesn't want to talk about that because they've kind of got a cursory knowledge of trauma-informed therapy or trauma-informed politics. So you got to really wonder, Is capital punishment revenge? Well, maybe. Now, is revenge valid for certain offenses? What offenses would we say that capital punishment is justified? Well, maybe we'll get to that in a minute. Right now, we really have to take a look at whether we consider justice, the principle of justice. Is justice supposed to punish or rehabilitate? And the question of whether justice can punish or rehabilitate hinges on whether a person can be rehabilitated or if they need to be punished. I'm not an advocate for torture. Don't get me wrong, but I am an advocate for euthanasia. And we really need to wonder if a person degenerates, if a person progressively, whether for their own choices, their lack of choices, their lack of hard work to be a better human being, or if they're just lazy, or through progressive traumas, they get pushed down to be a monster. Are they even human anymore? Is a monster, has it lost its humanity? If you really want a window into, I guess, the highest documented or one of the worst documented monsters of history, you can look up the gentleman named Karl Panzram. Karl Panzram was absolutely a monster through progressive traumas growing up. He was beaten by his family, raped by hobos, beaten in jail, beaten in youth facilities, until he realized that he was growing stronger and bigger than those around him, and then he decided to take his pain out on the world. And this man, when they finally caught him, he was in and out of facilities, chained to walls, beaten, hosed, raped, all that stuff. He started doing that to the world. And he has an autobiography. You can look it up. It's called Panzram. And this is the documentation of somebody without a conscience. Now, in Hebrew mysticism, they call this a shell of a being, which is Clifoth, right? Like those principles which the divine light of empathy and compassion and humanity do not shine through anymore, and you're an empty shell, a sociopath, a psychopath. So Karl Panzram became a monster. And by the time they finally executed him, they have a conservative number that he's raped and beaten over 2,000 people, mostly boys and men, and he'd murdered over 25 people. And this is at a time when they didn't have an infrastructure to track what he was doing. He would like buy a boat or rent a crew to boat him around South America, and then he would progressively rape and kill everybody that was his crew and feed them to alligators and go and do it again. So, will a gentleman like Karl Panzram, can he be rehabilitated? He's degenerated to basically a monster, a violent, predatory monster. Can we rehabilitate an unrepentant predator? Do we hold them for $200,000 a year off of our taxpayers' funded infrastructure because of our bleeding heart? Or do we euthanize them? If they hate life so much they wish to inflict their pain on everybody around them, do we just euthanize them? And I'm not advocating the revenge punitive aspect that they should feel the pain that they inflicted on each others. That's just something I don't advocate for. I think just put them out of their misery. But is that revenge? Is it punishment? Has a monster forfeited the divine spark of humanity when they choose to behave repeatedly atrociously through rape and murder and exploitation towards everything around them? Now, do we rehabilitate that? And how can you rehabilitate something without a conscience, without empathy, without, I guess, any core spark of humanity in it? How can you? Can you? That's a pretty deep pit to try and drag somebody's consciousness out of when they're preoccupied with their self-fulfilling pleasure seeking. That's a hell state, really. The Buddhists call it a hell state. You're existing in a state of hellishness. Now, I tend to believe, this is my personal interpretation, you could take or leave, that this is kind of the esoteric element of what Christianity talks about. If you behave right, you get to heavenly states, and if you behave wrong, you achieve hellish states, right? Now, can we rehabilitate a monster, or do we simply eliminate them? Now, we do need to consider the fact that, due to our wonderful infatuation with technology, that humans are essentially the monsters of this world to every other species. We use our technology, or maybe it's technology itself that's using humans in order to, exploit and consume and commodify everything. But how many of these social justice woke types really apply this principle to their own narrative of liberation and hierarchy. So if capital punishment is revenge, okay, cool. What do we deserve as a species when we systematically oppressed and exploited every indigenous occurring wildlife that existed since our first emergence from Africa, evolutionarily? You know, we skipped over an ocean to Australia. We skipped over an ocean to Southeast Asia. And within a period of very short time, all of the megafauna was hunted and slaughtered by our species colonization. So where's the justice in that? Will there be a divine or ecological or global justice when eventually you follow colonialism back and you realize that it's not just the white cisgendered heterosexual men, it's all of Europe. And then it's not just all of Europe, it's Rome. And it's not just Rome, it's also the Ottoman Empire. And it's not just the Ottoman Empire, it's actually the Egyptian Empire. It's humanity itself that has consistently been the oppressing element of all other ecological life on this planet. Will our decolonization go back that far? Will we realize that, like, we are on the top globally of the hierarchy? You know, anybody who's listening to this podcast on some fucking $1,000 cell phone is already part of the 1% globally, economically. And you are already privileged as much as you like to use the word privilege. And you are already on the top of one hierarchy. And you only don't like hierarchies that you are not on the top of. So you're just kind of striving to be on the top of the hierarchy. And once you're there, you figure that you're going to be the benevolent leader. No, you're not. You're going to be the next tyrant. That's how it always works. All your models of communism or socialism leading to communism, leading to tyrannical, socialism, they all end up with like a hierarchy. They all end up with corruption. They all end up with suppression of human rights. So you use human rights to gain power so you could suppress human rights. And it's very interesting, as opposed to a functional system where, guess what? Some people end up falling and degenerating and becoming addicts and becoming predators. And some people end up, with far too much, like the billionaires versus the junkie down on East Hastings. So these hierarchies, are they only negative when you're not on the top? And even a junkie on East Hastings is probably living a better life than a starving African child or somebody who's like working his fingers to the bones in a lithium mine in the Congo for a guy with an AK-47 that'll shoot him if he doesn't do it. So you tell me which hierarchy are we on top of? And are we as a humanity going to be accountable to all of the atrocity that we've done to the oceans and to the trees and to the water and to the air and to the animals? Or do you not want that justice to happen? It's only justice when it's in your benefit, right? What have you given up? Are you a vegan? Are you walking to work? Are you still drinking coffee from exploited farmers in Colombia? You tell me where your human rights or where your social justice really lies. So this carries me over to the other argument that I had with this Satanist, that the new version of social justice woke advocates, and Satanic temple advocates for liberation from artificial authority. Okay, cool. I understand that. And I support that. And I did it for a long time. Man, you got no right to tell me how to live. I'm going to do what I want. Well, okay. Well, what is the authority that you're following? What is the litmus test for your own morality then? So if you're against the artificial authorities that are pushing themselves on you, what is the measure? What is your legitimate authority? Where is your yardstick of good versus bad? What is the model that you are setting up that says this is an ideal that we aspire towards, and this is the bad that we're running from or that we don't want to go to? Because these social justice woke tend to think that controlling others is bad, judging others is bad, and freedom and liberty to do whatever you will is good.
Tell me something, Mr. Guthrie. Do you have gossip here? Gossip? I've often wondered if it can survive in so remote a location. You see, gossip is what holds civilization together. It reinforces shame. And without shame, well, the world is a very dangerous place. I'm sorry. I don't understand.
See, Aleister Crowley, if you look up the occultist Aleister Crowley and his principle of liberty, as described in a document that he wrote called Liber Oz, he outlines, basically a principle of liberty without restraint. And this is the ideal that a lot of these Satanists base their morality on. That man has a right to live where he will, do what he will, fuck who he will, eat what he will, wear what he will, move where he will, without restraint. And man has a right to kill those who would thwart these laws. That's the liberty without restraint. But Aleister Crowley was also accused of abuse and child abuse and sexual abuse and all kinds of horrible stuff, drug abuse. He was an addict and a psychopath, a sociopath, basically, because he was a husk of a man that was seeking pleasure and calling it ritual. And he did some of the most horrific stuff to people, and he manipulated and stole and like psychologically abused people. But that's liberty, man. That's liberty. He's living according to his true will. You got no right to judge him. So, of course, Satanists advocate for liberty and tolerance, regardless of what exactly you're tolerating, because the inevitable result of liberty and tolerance is hedonism and deprivation. So, liberty without discernment, it's chaos. It leads to chaos, which again allows the strongest and most brutal to do what they will to those that cannot defend themselves. So when these people are advocating human rights away from artificial authority, limitation of artificial authority, well, human rights to do what? You want to be equal, but what if you're not equal? What if you're a degenerate? What if you're a rapist? What if you're a murderer? What if you're a sexual exploiter? Are you equal to those people that put those inclinations on the back burner? Is like Mother Teresa equal to Aleister Crowley? Like, well, by your merit, yeah, man. Like, I get it on some levels because, like, the Hindu principle of Namaste recognizes that the conscious light in you is the same conscious light that animates me. We are all children of one divine root. But Hinduism also says that the conscious decisions that you make with your free will in this life put you at a certain level on a hierarchy. And the hierarchy is what these people want to dismantle. They want to dismantle order. They want to dismantle law. They want to dismantle things to be replaced with what? You want your human rights to do what? You want to live according to pleasure without self-discipline. And what will you do without self-discipline? What will you do without limitations? Where will this go? So will we allow us to our behavior to cross the line into non-consensual pleasure or exploitation? And who's to say no? So, of course, they'll say, no, we're never going to cross the line between non-consent. That's immoral. That's one of the worst things you could do is push your will on another. Okay, cool. That's great. Good. Let's start with that. Because I was involved with consensual BDSM for a long time. I whipped people. I beat people that wanted to be whipped and beaten. And we had these conversations. So if during these conversations, I found that if somebody is really good at jargon and debate and semantic justification, they can convince almost all of us that your human rights should allow you to do almost anything, as long as there's consent, man. So let's play with this, because these people are largely considered taboo in the BDSM underworld, but they exist. And if you have conversations with them, oh man, they've got all the justifications and all the semantic arguments on why this stuff should be allowed, man. So I've had the conversations with these people, and I've seen them talking about, maybe not all these people, but I've had conversations that surround this, and I've seen them on the forums. And they talk about how, is it non-consensual to have sex with an animal that's consenting to have sex? Well, I wouldn't do it. I think it's absolutely biologically reprehensible. And I don't know if an animal can consent to have sex. And then they come back and they say, well, if a dog is humping your leg, it obviously wants to have sex. So what's stopping me from having sex with it? Well, in my mind, basic human decency, basic biological law. But who am I to say, right? Who am I to judge? Who am I to gatekeep? Again, what if somebody says, man, if something can't refused consent, shouldn't I be allowed to have sex with a corpse? Why would you want to do that? Well, that's not even the issue, man. I want to know, can I have sex with a corpse? Because I'm not violating consent then. Well, I think it's fucking disgusting, and I don't think it's healthy, and I think there's something psychologically wrong with you or imbalanced with you. Why would you want to do that? Man, who are you to judge, man? I'm not violating consent. Oh, all right. Okay, cool. So what if a child, because there is a subset of like the underground LGBTQ plus, the plus, there is a subset of the plus that says, well, man, 10-year-olds can be sexualized. I've seen 6-year-olds have orgasms, so can't they consent to sex? No, they can't. Their brains haven't formulated the consequences of their actions. It's such an imbalance between experience and inexperience that why would you want to do that? You're just playing with power. You want to dominate. You want to take power. But these people, they're really good with the semantic justifications. Hell, they're filling up the universities right now because they regard tolerance as a virtue regardless of the thing being tolerated. And you can listen to them. They write books. The non-binary individual that came up with the term minor attracted person wrote an entire book about the justifications for child attraction, minor attracted people, intergenerational relationships, because these people don't want self-restraint to their personal liberty.
We're going to play queer theory. We're going to play queer theory pedophilia Jeopardy. Okay, answer. Commonly called the godfather of queer theory.
Who is Foucault?
Who is Foucault?
I got it.
Okay, 100 points. Foucault. Another way to ask this is who argued, no, I guess the answer would be, argued for the eradication of age of consent laws as in down to infants.
Who is Foucault?
Thank you. Okay. Next one. And since you're not believing me, quote, this is in the founding document of queer theory. Like communists and homosexuals in the 1950s, boy lovers are so stigmatized that it is difficult to find defenders of their civil liberties, let alone for their erotic orientation. That's in the founding document of queer theory. I'm sorry, I'm using facts. A thousand apologies. One must never let facts in the way. Okay, so up to 200. Now it is pedophilia and queer theory for 300. That would be author of Macho Sluts. Author of Macho Sluts and Public Sex. Pat Califia. Okay, here's something by Pat Califia. Pat Califia has written, any child old enough to decide whether or not she or he wants to eat spinach, play with trucks, or wear shoes is old enough to decide whether or not she wants to run around naked in the sun, masturbate, sit in someone's lap, or engage in sexual activity, by which she does not mean play doctor, she means with adults. And she's very clear about that because she also says that pedophiles should be more and not less invested in children's lives. Okay, now we have for 500, we have the last one in the queer theory and pedophilia. The answer is queer theorist who has spoken out strongly against pedophilia.
Zero. Who is no one?
Who is no one? Not a single one. Because the entire thing is based on transgressing. Yeah, I know. Dear fucking God.
So I asked this one BDSM, this leather lesbian one time, I'm like, well, where do you consider consent ending? And she said, well, I think that's when it comes to permanent body modification and mutilation. I'm like, but in the kink community, we brand people, we pierce people, we tattoo people, we do scarification. Does that count? And she's like, well, no, because people they consented to it. So I asked her a scenario, which is a true scenario of something that happened in Germany about consent, okay? And whether we have a right to judge what people do consensually. And there's these two people, they met on a forum. One person wanted to be cannibalized and the other person wanted to eat a person. So they agreed to meet, and the person that wanted to be cannibalized, consensually, he committed suicide, and then the other person spent a few days chopping him up and eating him. Sort of like a consensual Jeffrey Dahmer thing. As a society, should we accept that? Because at least it didn't violate consent? Euthanasia, suicide? Should we accept it because it doesn't violate consent? Oh, or should we assist impressionable children in sterilizing themselves and mutilating their genitalia? Because they're consenting? Because these are the exact same people that say that, well, if if a child can consent to gender modification in their own sexual decisions in that manner, how far is it before children will be able to consent to other sexual acts? If we're sexualizing children and training to watch men shake their genitalia and twerk in front of them in cosplay, and we're messing with their gender and their sexuality and educating them on sexual behavior and masturbation and dildos and things like that in elementary school, how long until these people that are advocates of liberty without restraint will say that, well, shit, they can consent to other sexual acts? Well, it's not going to be long, because it's happening right now. We can see these debates starting to rise with the movement of tolerance without restraint. We've got no litmus test to where this stuff ends, because the average rational human being, rational central human being, isn't saying enough is enough. And once again, I hate to tell you people, but if you're on the woke end of the spectrum to the extreme where we have to tolerate without discernment, you're in the same camp as the Satanists. Literally, look it up. Go look up the Satanic Temple, because they're advocating for the exact same thing as the woke people are. Because they call it human rights, and they call it justice, and they call it equality. Now, if you take a look at these as archetypal ideals, like the transcendental model of health and fitness and balance being, physically, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually, versus hedonism, physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual hedonism. Well, the hell has the open borders. You can do whatever you want to get into a suffering state, to get into degradation, to get into depravity, to get into degeneracy. Hell has open borders, while the principles of heaven has a strict immigration policy. Not everybody gets there. Wide is the road that leads into hell states, and long and hard is the path that leads up to heaven states. And you can attribute these things to psychological states of being, of consciousness. You can attribute all of this to your mental state and how you are living. But people don't, because it's easy to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We no longer give a damn about what these traditions, these sacred traditional knowledge base of precolonial or esoteric Christian and monotheistic models have to teach us, because we say it's superstition. Oh, you believe in an invisible sky daddy that judges us? No, I believe in my highest self that judges my immoral behavior. I believe in a right and a wrong, put forward by thousands of years of philosophy that in the last 15, 20 years we've thrown out. It's ridiculous. I've been to Japan. A clean and orderly house doesn't let muddy boots trample all over the place. And walking around there, I felt like a barbarian. We need to consider this, because we're going out of control. We're spinning. The Hindus call it Kali Yuga, a time when our ethics and our direction and our transcendental sacred direction has been usurped by materialism and degeneration. So once again, yes, we need to recognize that if Nazis agree with your policies, that's something to examine, and we need to stop the extremism. But once again, I'm bringing it back. Hey, left-wing woke fuck job. If literal Satanists are agreeing with your policies, this is something you need to examine. Why have we allowed our society to eliminate the sacred? We are living in imbalance. If you're so into indigenous spirituality, we need to look at the holistic aspect, where physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual self. Why have we culled off? Why have we castrated the spiritual aspect of our society in favor of an imbalance towards the physicality? Why are we castrating the psychological, rational element of our society in favor of emotionality? That is a toxic imbalance towards, realistically, the feminine, while degenerating or denigrating the divine masculine. And this needs to be resolved. This needs to be examined. This needs to be, stopped while it's ahead. I think I've gone off a little long today. Hopefully you got something of that. I wish the best for anybody who's on the same journey as me towards a better life, I encourage you to find a tradition and stick to it, learn about it. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter what culture you're from. Find those traditions. Be a better person in the right ways. Seek to refine yourself versus just fall into whatever degenerate hedonism feels good in the moment. Because self-refinement is one of the traditional principles over the last thousands of years that every spiritual tradition has talked about. Self-refinement, balance, fitness, and health versus imbalance, self-degeneration, and weakness. Thanks for listening. This has been Pitboss Review number 11. I think it's a good one. Like, comment, subscribe, ask questions, give me ideas for future podcasts, and we'll go from there. Peace, love, and granola, people. Wish you all the best.